And David said that he didn't know if he was gliding down the tunnel, if he was actually moving spiritually, that his psychic self was really moving down there, or if it was just an incredibly vivid dream. But whichever it was, he was conscious of moving through this dark tunnel towards the light. And he could then hear the sound of music. And as he got closer to the light, he saw a carousel, a roundabout with the horses and the other figures. And it was just as if it was at a fairground. It was brilliantly lit. It was radiant with color. And there were happy people sitting on all of the animals on the carousel. And they were waving and smiling. And he said the light and the joy, the sheer happiness of the thing really reached him. He said it was a kind of symbol of happiness. And then he realized, without being afraid, he realized that everyone on that carousel was someone he knew who had died, like a grandparent or a great uncle or an old friend who had been a good neighbor and had looked after him when he was a kid. And there they were, riding in a state of ecstatic joy and looking at pictures of perfect health. And he wanted to join them. And he said, I moved towards the carousel. I wanted them to stop so I could jump on with them and share that ecstatic joy and that bright light and glorious color. And they waved him back and said, no, David, it's not your time. We have called you so that we can tell you you're going to get well and you're going to have many years of happy life on earth before you join us. And then the light faded and he seemed to be sucked back down the tunnel and found himself in bed. But inside him now there was a feeling of hope and new mental, spiritual strength. And he managed to get out of bed. He got his, what we call in the UK, a Walkman, which is, headphones attached to your music player. And he got his headphones on and turned his music on. And this is a guy who's been too weak even to get out of bed. He was hanging onto the bed rail and trying to dance to the music and just rejoicing. He felt so different inside. Well, then in came the consultant cancer specialist who'd been caring for him and doing all he could palliatively. And he had some medical students with him. He'd been bringing them round to explain to them with great sadness that this young man was dying. And David said he'll never forget it, that the surgeon was overcome with emotion on finding him out of bed and trying to dance. And he just put his arms around him and said, David, you're in remission. I don't understand it, but it's wonderful. He said, and his consultant almost burst into tears of happiness at this miracle that had happened for him. And the recovery went very, very well, and we were with him just a few weeks ago. He now lives in Croydon in the UK, not far from London. And he is very successful in his professional work. He's into gents clothing, what we call gents outfitting. And there's a very special area in London which is called Savile Row. And Savile Row gives its name to high-class tailoring, making suits and gents outfitting in general. And David is a manager for a big company there, which was his life's ambition before he was ill. He's fascinated by gents outfitting, and he wanted to be, a top tailor and sell suits of distinction, and that's what he now does. And it's just wonderful to see what happened. But he centers his recovery on that miraculous vision that he had of this gloriously happy group of people who were in the next world, who were riding this roundabout, this carousel, which was a symbol of the joy that they were experiencing in the world that they'd reached.
And you are an ordained minister, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes, in the, if I can just explain this some depth, I think probably the closest I could get to making it comprehensible to friends in the USA is that it's been like your Episcopal Church, because we have bishops in our church. This is the what we call the Church of England, except that in Wales, the Church of England, or Anglican Church as we call it, the one that has its headquarters in Canterbury with Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, we in Wales are a separate province, Steve. We are as independent of the English Church as the American Episcopal Church is, or the Church of Canada, or the Church of India, or the Church of Germany. And it's a 3-year training course to become an ordained priest in that church. And what happened, I think what we would say in the USA was a high school principal. I was what we call a headmaster of a big comprehensive school with students aged 11 up to 18. Had about 1,000 students and 60 or 70 staff. And one of our boys, lovely kid, was helping his brother in a food warehouse just before Christmas. And the young fellow was riding on top of a forklift truck as they moved the stores from one part of the warehouse to another. And the driver forgot that he had a man on top of his forklift, and he went underneath the doorway, and the boy was killed. And of course, as the principal of the school he had attended, I felt it was my duty, as well as just human sympathy, to go and see his grief-shattered family, and I went to see them and just shared with them my simple but layman's Christian faith, as it was then, that there was another world and that they would one day see their son again, even though it was a terrible grief for them at the time. And after I'd spent an hour or so with them, his sister came to the door with me and said, "Headmaster, I don't know what you've done for my mother, but she is better and calmer after you did your best to explain to her that you believe in another world and she will see Peter again." And I felt that that was a kind of message that if I'd been able to help in however small a way this one grief-stricken lady who's Peter's mother, whose grief must have been beyond words, if I could help her with the sharing of my faith, maybe I ought to try and do it a bit bigger area and a wider extent. And I applied for training, and they accepted me as a trainee priest and did a 3-year course. It was a bit like doing an external degree, because I was still doing my teaching during the day, running the school. And in our church in Wales, we have a number of guys like me who volunteer not to take a church house, and we don't take a salary, and we don't take a church car or telephone. We pay our own way, and we do our church work voluntarily. And in this way, a number of us who are part-time volunteers, earning our living doing other things. I have a friend who, until he retired recently, was a priest and an optician, another one priest and a pharmacist, and yet another one who was ordained when I was, who is a priest and a lawyer. And so we earn our living doing our own things, like me as a writer and broadcaster, and still do quite a lot of teaching as well. And then you do your church work as and when and how you can when people need you. And this is, I find that by having a foot in both camps, in other words, by having to earn my living in the ordinary workaday world, I am probably closer to the people that, as a priest, I want to help than if I was a full-time priest, shall we say, living in that exclusive priestly area. But I am, as you said, Steve, a fully ordained Anglican priest, doing as much for the church as I can in between earning my living.
Absolutely. And you've also written a book about mysteries of the Bible. We're, of course, talking to Lionel Fanthorpe here. And one of the mysteries that you covered in your book was one that's always interested me, the prophet Ezekiel. What exactly did he see?
Wow, that's a wonderful one. Love to talk to you about that and to our listeners, Steve. Ezekiel describes in vivid detail how he saw what he thought was either God himself or an angelic being flying towards him, and the way he described it, particularly when he went into the detail of the mechanics of this great thing that was shining with light and that was, flying towards him and landing, the way he described the wheels. And he said there were wheels within wheels. Now, one of the engineers responsible for designing the vehicles that were used in exploration on the lunar surface, he used just such a device. If we can imagine, this is awfully difficult. It's rather as if this is one of the occasions I wish I had a camera, but so we could show our listeners. But if we can imagine an ordinary tire from a car, and instead of being in one big solid piece of rubber all the way around, imagine that the tire is in sections. Or, to think of it another way, imagine that we had made a circle of pieces the size of, say, a can of beans or a can of beer, and we'd put, say, 15 or 20 of those cans in a circle, each one so linked to its neighbor that it is able to rotate on that axis, while the main wheel, of which it forms a 1/15th part, is able to roll forward. Now, if you've got a wheel like that, and you're stationary, and you can throw in the appropriate control mechanism, you can make that thing move sideways, because the bottom two cans of the two front wheels, or say the bottom four cans of all four wheels, will simply rotate left or right at 90 degrees to the general rotation which they use when they're going forward as part of this 15-can wheel construction. Now, I don't know if I've made that sort of visible without having a picture, but I'm sure you... Yeah?
Yeah,
I'm sure you get what I mean. And so when the space engineer designed this, he said himself in his book on it that it was based on Ezekiel's phrase, wheels within wheels, or, a wheel which can turn in either direction at 90 degrees to itself. So what we've got there from Ezekiel's vision makes it sound even more as if it was some kind of spaceship, some kind of vehicle that was capable of traveling not only through the air, but coming from a very long way away, and that there, roughly 3,000 years ago, we've got this amazing machine in the Middle East come to explore our Earth, come to bring a message. Certainly, Ezekiel took message from it, and I would go along with the theory that what he very probably saw was some sort of UFO, and whether the aliens within it were taking an interest in earthly religion and earthly politics and had come to help this good prophet to give a worthwhile message to his people, well, I think that's an open question. We say the jury is out on that one, but it sounded much more to me like a visitor from space than an angelic being or even the Lord